people who are self-aware are happier with their lives. They feel more in control. They're less anxious, less stressed, less depressed. Sometimes people say, can I be too self-aware? And what I think is behind that question is almost like people are worried about flipping over so that they're so focused on themselves or how other people see them that they start to get neurotic about it. And what we learned with our highly self-aware people is they were just as self-accepting as they were self-aware.
Yesterday I was clever, so I wanted to change the world. Today I am wise, so I am changing myself. Rumi. Hey my friends, this is Nishant and welcome to the Nishant Garg Show. This is a podcast about helping you live a fulfilled life, and my job on this show is to invite the world-class experts to extract the practices, routines and habits to help you live a fulfilled and abundant life. Today's guest is Dr. Tasha Eurich. Dr. Tasha is an organizational psychologist, researcher and New York Times bestselling author. With a PhD in organizational psychology, she is also the founder of the Eurich Group, where she has helped thousands of leaders and teams improve their effectiveness through greater self-awareness. Dr. Eurich has contributed to Entrepreneur, CNBC.com, and the Huffington Post, and has been featured in outlets such as Forbes, the New York Times, Fast Company, and Inc. She has been named one of Denver Business Journal's 40 Under 40, as well as a top 100 thought leader by Trust Across America. And in 2015, she was named a leader to watch by the American Management Association. Her TEDx talk has been viewed more than 2 million times. In this episode, Tasha talks about how to respond to a negative feedback, building self-awareness in personal and professional life, why are we so much less self-aware than we think, and much, much more. Without further ado, please enjoy this wide-ranging conversation with Tasha. Tasha, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. So excited to talk to you.
I've been following your work for quite some time, and I was really looking forward to having this conversation. So I had pages and pages of notes and questions for you. So we'll see how far we can go in this short
Yeah, let's get
conversation. So I found that you are a music theater nerd. Can we talk about your music fun experience?
Sure. So I have been in love with theater since I was very, probably 10 or 11 years old. And I even did some professional acting when I was in my late teens and was actually a theater major in college at university, and then had to make a decision about whether I wanted to do theater or psychology as my career. And I decided from a self-awareness standpoint, I was probably a little bit better at psychology than I was at theater. I was okay, but a lot of my friends who have gone on to have really successful careers as, Broadway actors and movie stars, I just wasn't quite up at their level. So it's actually something that I'm still very passionate about as now an audience member. I went from, performing and directing to just appreciating theater. And I'm so excited for it to come back, hopefully soon.
Got it. And I usually ask this question to all my guests. So Tasha, what does your first 60 to 90 minutes in the morning look like?
Well, I'm not a morning person, so that would be the first data point I would give you. I like to start my mornings, especially in COVID times, very calmly. So I like to have some coffee, usually one big cup. I like to catch up on the news. I have to have a little tiny poodle that I take care of that needs help in the morning sometimes. So just try to be as calm as possible. Although in a normal time, my mornings, consist of maybe I'm waking up in Sydney, Australia, and I have jet lag, and I get to do an amazing presentation to a group of leaders. So again, I think COVID life and regular life are very different, but I'm happy for the opportunity to just slow down a little bit.
I like to go into the specifics. So I would love to ask you, what kind of coffee do you drink?
So my husband and I have a little bit of a role reversal where he is kind enough to make sure we have all the food we need. So I don't know. I have it with a little bit of honey and some heavy cream in the morning.
All right. And let's talk about some self-awareness thing. So the world knows about you that you are the queen of self-awareness. When
Well,
did
that's good to hear.
when did you realize that you needed to research on self-awareness?
It was sort of a gradual process in some sense where I've been an organizational psychologist now for more than 15 years. And what I kept seeing over and over with the executives I coach is the ones who were willing to look at themselves in the mirror and see who they were very clearly, to understand how they were coming across, what they stood for, how they could be better, were always more successful than the ones who preferred to see themselves with rose-colored glasses, as an example. But what I was seeing in the world was, people, if anything, becoming less and less self-aware. So what I wanted to do, this was almost 7 years ago now, was understand, there was this management buzzword of self-awareness at the time. And everybody kept talking about how important it was. And everyone had common wisdom to share about how to become more self-aware. And what I wanted to do was scientifically test all of that. So I have a research team from all around the US, and we wanted to ask the questions of, what is self-awareness really? Where does it come from? Why do we need it? And how do we get more of it? And what's been so fascinating is we've had so many surprises in what we discovered in terms of what it actually takes to be self-aware, how learnable self-awareness is. And I was really grateful that we came at it from that angle. And what I love about science is the science is what the science is. And that gives us so much information and kind of sets us free and shows us what's the path we can take to truly become self-aware. So it was informed by the work that I was doing with leaders, but ultimately we just let the data tell us what was really happening.
And as I listen to this podcast, I'm thinking, what is self-awareness?
That's such a good place to start. I think it's a term that many people throw around. It's like the word communication.
Mm-hmm.
Two people using the word communication, two people using the word self-awareness might have very different views of it. And it took our team almost a year to scientifically define, what do we know about ourselves when we're self-aware? And what we came up with based on, hundreds of journal articles, surveying thousands of people all around the world, is self-awareness is made up of two types of self-knowledge. So to be self-aware, you have to have both. And those are, number one, knowing who we are internally, which we call internal self-awareness. And number two, knowing how we're coming across to others, knowing how we're seen, which we call external self-awareness. And a very fascinating data point was those two types of knowledge about ourselves are completely independent. So just because, for example, we know ourselves internally doesn't mean we know how we're coming across. Or just because we're focused on getting feedback from other people doesn't necessarily mean we know what we want out of life. And that's a really helpful place to start.
Was there any instance in your life when you realized that you are not self-aware and then you needed to work on this?
How long do you have?
I have
so many
time.
Examples.
Any one or two memorable instances?
Oh gosh, well, I write about one in Insight actually that stands out. So when I started this project, I thought, who better than me to explain to everyone how to be more self-aware, right? I've been coaching executives for all this time, and I'm clearly so in touch with who I am and how I come across. And as it turns out, I was completely wrong. There was one moment, the funny part was when I was writing the chapter in the book about external self-awareness. Literally, you can't even make this stuff up. I went out to have some drinks and dinner with a couple of friends, and through, there's a lot to the story. I won't bore you with all the details, but essentially what it came down to was my friend who had a little bit too much to drink, who I had known at that time for about 10 years, moseyed up to me and she said, "Tasha, I am so glad we're friends. I'm so glad that Dave, my husband, brought you into our lives all of those years ago." And I was sitting there smiling and just being so appreciative of my friend. But she continued. She said, and I quote, "And boy, have you come a long way since we first met you." I'm sitting there, I'm like, what is she talking about? I literally have no idea what she's talking about. And, in any situation where we get surprising feedback, we have two doors that we can go through. Door one is change the subject or decide that they're wrong. And door two is learn more. So I decided it would be professionally irresponsible if I didn't pick door 2. And I learned pretty quickly that apparently when I first met that group of friends that were my husband's friends and now are both of our friends, it was a little bit high maintenance, apparently. Had anyone told me this? Had my husband told me this? No, not a single person had given me that feedback. And what I like about that story, in addition to just being kind of comical and showing that I have just as much work to do as anyone on this, is that there's so much information and knowledge that the people around us have that they may or may not be sharing with us. And, in this case, luckily I had, quote, come a long way, so I didn't have as much work to do. But I always keep that in the back of my mind as something that was a perception of me. And, I think it just underscores how important it is to be in charge of getting as much feedback as we can.
When you started working on self-awareness in your own personal life, could you tell us some of the practices that you adopted?
Sure. So probably the hardest one for me to adopt has been meditation. And we know empirically that people who are self-aware are more likely to practice mindfulness. And one way to do that, of course, is to meditate. And I've actually noticed that I have been better at meditating since the pandemic because I'm not running around all the time. But that's been important. I implemented something that we learned from our research subjects, people who didn't start out as self-aware, but who learned to see themselves clearly. It was something I named the daily check-in. And it's basically at the end of the day, take 2 minutes and answer the following 3 questions. So question 1 is, what went well today? Question 2 is, what didn't go so well today? And question 3 is, how can I be smarter tomorrow? And what I like about that practice is, do I do it 7 days a week, 365 days a year? No. Do I do it most days? I do. And every time I reflect on that, it gives me some kind of incremental insight about who I am, what I want, how I'm doing. And so that's another thing about self-awareness that we discovered that I thought was surprising is it's not about these huge flashes of insight where we just wait, everything is clear to me now. It's really about incremental daily improvement.
So you mentioned 2 practices. One is meditation and second is, we can say, journaling, where we have 3 prompts: what went well, what didn't go well, so to speak, or how can I be more smarter tomorrow? What time of the day do you meditate?
Honestly, whenever I have time. I found that as the day wears on, I feel like I have less time. So typically, unless I'm, on back-to-back meetings all day or doing a virtual workshop, usually around 2 or 3 p.m. is when I have the most luck at making time I usually do yoga first, and then I meditate immediately after.
Because I have had so many meditation experts on this podcast, so I asked them, what's your posture look like? So Tasha, same question to you. What's your posture in meditation look like?
So it changes. Some days it feels better to lay down. Some days I sit cross-legged. Some days I sit up against a wall, like if I'm just honestly feeling so tired. But I haven't found that one of them works better than any other in general. I try to ask, what do I need to do today to meditate in the best way that I can?
Do you suggest meditation to your corporate clients and to executive coaches?
It's interesting because I am not a model of meditation. I think I've gotten better, but there are some clients who really are interested in doing it, and I help them as I can. There are some clients who are just not interested. And what I love about mindfulness is there are lots of other techniques to be mindful that don't require you to meditate. Meditation is one way, but sometimes if a client isn't interested in meditating, but they want to have more in the moment insight, I give them a couple of tools that they can use on a daily basis that will sort of serve that same purpose.
Could you tell us about those tools in brief?
Sure. So one of them, I'll just share one. I talk about a couple in Insight, but I call it comparing and contrasting. And the way to understand non-meditative mindfulness is it's helpful to go back to the definition. And this is Alan Langer's definition, who's one of the foremost experts on meditation, I'm sure, as you know. And it's basically noticing new things. She says noticing novel distinctions. And if you think about it that way, this practice of noticing new things without judgment or interpretation. For example, let's say you're having a bad day and you're just not feeling great. And you say, I felt a lot better yesterday. A good comparing and contrasting question there would be, what's different about my day today than it was yesterday? Or by that same token, you could think like, wow, I feel great today. What are the other times recently that I felt this great? And what do they have in common? And I might, for me, just to use that tool in practice, what I found is if I don't have any interaction with other people, even virtually, I get kind of down. But on the days that I do too much virtual interaction, I also get down. And I've used the comparing and contrasting tool to learn that I have like a happy medium of this is the amount of time I can be on video calls per day, and that's it. So it's helpful just to find, it's like those micro insights. I didn't discover the truth about myself in that one insight, but it's really helped me figure out how to live my best life in the pandemic.
Yeah, and I'm having this question in my mind that what books did you study or your team studied when you were researching scientifically on self-awareness?
So we focused mostly on empirical articles, so peer-reviewed research, but there were a couple of books that were just immensely helpful. And the one that's coming to mind is Timothy Wilson's book. It's called Strangers to Ourselves. And he is such a brilliant researcher. We looked at a lot of his scientific work as well, but this book does such a good job of showing basically how no matter how hard humans try, we are never going to be able to access a lot of our unconscious thoughts and feelings and motives. And there's just so much fascinating research on this. And I think, part of what I tried to do with Insight was bring a lot of it into, kind of more mainstream, non-academic circles. But Timothy Wilson's work is I think it's just seminal in this area.
So if you're in a social gathering and somebody asks you, what do you do? How would you respond? You do so many things that
Right.
How would you describe to somebody what you do?
Okay, so basically the overall heading that I use is that I'm an organizational psychologist. So my job is to help leaders and organizations be successful and create cultures where people are engaged and can kind of do their best work. And under that, there's a lot of activities that I do to help me be an organizational psychologist. So one of them is I write books. Another one is I'm a keynote speaker. Another is I do training for organizations. Another is I do keynote speaking. So the way I look at it is those are just different ways of being an organizational psychologist. But my purpose in life is, in a nutshell, it's to help people be the best of who they are and the best of what they do.
Would your family describe in the same way or they have different angle?
This is actually really funny. We were having a socially distant social engagement with two of our friends that we hadn't seen in a long time. Both of these, so it's a married couple, and I went to graduate school with both of them. So one of them has a PhD in the same field as I do in psychology, and another one has a PhD in social psychology. And the social psychologist, it's sort of this ongoing joke where he says, I still have no idea what you do all day.
That was me. Yeah.
And I'm like, Mark, I don't know how to break this down to you anymore. But, if you think about it, like different activities, for a CEO, they might have a shareholder call. They might, have a town hall. They might be answering emails, but that whole time they're CEO. They're just having sort of different approaches or activities to achieve that goal.
In the beginning of our conversation, you mentioned about feedback. I found one of your articles on Harvard Business Review that how to respond to negative feedback. So could you elaborate more on that, how we can better respond to a negative feedback?
That's a really important question because, step one is actually seeking more feedback, but we have to be prepared for what we learn. And again, I always go back to the science. So what did the data tell us? What we discovered when we interviewed highly self-aware people who didn't start out that way is they did several things pretty differently when it came to difficult or surprising feedback. The first thing they did differently was they didn't take it at face value. I think so often when we get feedback that is surprising or, that we just didn't anticipate, we think like, how have I been so wrong this whole time? I never had any idea that people saw me as X. But it's also important to realize that feedback from one person it's one perspective. Now, of course, if it's your boss, for example, I would say like, probably you want to take that as seriously as you possibly can. But let's say it's not. Let's say it's a colleague or a friend. The first step there is to figure out how many people are seeing this behavior. In other words, sometimes when people give us feedback, it's more about the person giving us the feedback than about us. So we just want to run it through that lens. And what I suggest people do is finding a few people in your life, professionally, personally, who you might ask for feedback from a little bit more. I call them your loving critics. So our study subjects had usually between 3 to 5 of people like that. And that's like a little built-in committee. So every time you get surprising feedback, take it to a couple of members of that group of loving critics and say, I'm hearing this. Have you experienced that in my behavior? Or is that something you've noticed before? And what you can do is get a pretty good view of how pervasive is this behavior. And you might find that, oh, surprise, everyone sees it. And then you know that you have a decision to make. But if nobody else sees the behavior, then you have another decision to make, which is how much should I be listening to this, sort of one-off feedback? How much do I care? Another thing that the highly self-aware people in our study did differently, it's pretty counterintuitive. So if we hear feedback that's really surprising, most, everybody that's listening to this is a successful, high-achieving person. They want to do better. They want to improve, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't be listening. But the temptation is we hear feedback and we want to immediately figure it out and respond, right? Like, okay, tomorrow I'm going to do this and this and this. But what our study subjects did differently was they actually just put that feedback in the back of their mind and waited, sometimes days, sometimes even weeks until they felt ready to approach it. And I think there's so much power in that if we're not careful, we can become too reactive and not as strategic and not as logical in the way we respond. So there's a lot of other suggestions, but I think those are probably the two most important I would share.
Is there a specific language to request for the feedback in our personal and professional life?
There's a couple ways you can do this. Maybe I'll take personal and professional a little bit differently.
Sure.
So personally, I think another goal of getting feedback often is to strengthen our relationships with other people. We're not trying to get a promotion. We just want to have a better marriage, as an example. So there's a great tool that I talk about in Insight called the Dinner of Truth. And this is an exercise that was created by a brilliant communications professor named Josh Meisner. And the way it works is essentially you find someone in your life whose opinion matters to you, who you want to strengthen your relationship with, and you take them out to virtual coffee or to get a drink or to have lunch. And during that, whatever it is you choose, you ask them the following question. What do I do that is most annoying to you? And then, wait for this. This is where it gets crazy.
Silence.
You listen. Yeah, you're silent and you listen. And then at the end, you say, thank you. And part of the reason, this is like a little tangent, but I think it's important. Part of the reason feedback is so scary is we feel like sometimes we have to justify it or we have to explain it. But my mentor and friend, Marshall Goldsmith, taught me that is the only option when someone gives you feedback is to say thank you. It doesn't mean you're going to act on it. It doesn't mean it's true, but thank you. So I think the Dinner of Truth sounds so scary, and I would never ask any clients or readers or podcast listeners to do any of these tools if I hadn't tried them myself. And what I'd say about the Dinner of Truth is it is always, unfailingly, a surprisingly positive experience. Because you've got this person who cares about you, who wants to help you be better. Sometimes they'll ask you, and then it can become like a mutual feedback conversation. But I would say if it sounds scary, try it. And as soon as you do, you'll see the value. So that's sort of on the personal side. I think I know that there's a lot there, so maybe we could stop there first.
When you had done this feedback exercise in your life first time, how did you react/respond to this? Was it challenging, easy for you?
There is a part of almost all of us that I think expects that when we ask for feedback, the other person will say, I'm glad you've asked. I have never really liked you in the first place, and I think you're a terrible person. And it never happens that way, right? So for me, it was just sucking it up, asking the question, taking a deep breath. And the first time I did this, it was with a friend of mine named Mike. And Mike is, if I looked at all my friends, he's probably the most crotchety friend. And that was why I picked him. I was like, I'm just going to go big this first time. And what he said to me was so interesting. So he thought for a minute. He's a very thoughtful guy. And he looked at me and he said, well, Tasha, my feedback would be, I love you in person, but I hate you on social media.
Wow.
And I was like, wow, exactly. I believe those were my exact words. And I wanted a little clarification. And he basically told me that every time I posted something on Facebook, it seemed to be with the express purpose of making other people think I was great, which of course, no one else in the world has that problem. But I thought, it had never even occurred to me that that was the way it was coming across, right? I was like, well, we're just on vacation and I'm sharing these photos. And that was why I thought it was so helpful is, it wasn't an indictment of me as a person, but it was very helpful, actionable feedback. And from that time, I think that conversation was in maybe 2016. I've really evolved the way I use social media, certainly personally, but also professionally. And so what we try to do when you're building a brand, sometimes you kind of have to post about yourself. But what we try to do is, 9 or 10 posts to help other people for every one potentially me-related post. And personally, I actually almost never post on Facebook or social media. I just see what everybody else is up to, and that just feels better for me. It feels more authentic to who I am. So it was just a great conversation and a great experience.
I've seen your tiny dog on Instagram.
Have you? See, I put her out there because I hope she'll make people's days as great as she makes mine.
So speaking on the feedback a little more, because we should not ask for this feedback to everybody. So how should we filter those people in our lives?
That's such an important question. I'm really glad you asked that. There are basically 2 criteria that we found in our study make for a good feedback giver. And there's a lot of people who have one, but very few people who meet both criteria. So the first is we have to believe that other person truly wants us to succeed. And, in our personal lives, that's usually easier. At work, we might have to be a little bit more discerning. There's a lot of different motives and scarcity thinking in some workplaces. And so just you should feel confident that person wants you to be successful. Does it mean that person has to be your best friend at work? Not necessarily. Sometimes the best most supportive people are colleagues that we don't know as well. We just see them and they've always helped us when we asked. So I think that's one. The second criteria is we also have to believe that they'll tell us the truth, especially when it's hard to hear. So, you think about the people in your life, there are probably a lot of people who would love to be critical of us and a lot of people who just love us no matter what. So finding the people who are, I call them loving critics, that is the sweet spot of feedback. And one other thing I'll say about these highly self-aware people and what they did differently is they didn't try to find 15 or 20 loving critics. It was usually about 3 to 5 people that they relied on a regular basis. So that's easy to do. Even think about how could I get 1 or 2 loving critics? It becomes a lot more doable.
Yes. Can I add something from my personal life, the kind of feedback I receive? So this is my vulnerable side for our listeners that I have gotten this feedback that you're kind of a guy who seems like your life is together. Everything is working fine. There is nothing wrong in your life. Why are you so happy? Why are you so driven? And I'm like, my response is, I have had my moments. Life is not easy. You got to work at it. It's not easy. So I have gotten this feedback that you seem like that. You have everything great going on in your life. My response always is no.
No. So what have you done with that? I'm curious. Has that changed anything you're doing in terms of how you show up or how you relate to other people?
I reflect. I don't take any feedback just like that personally. I would think about it. Then I would think, am I disrespecting somebody in any way? Or what can I do next time? So it's a great coaching, great question. So I don't have the right answer right now. It just being myself, just being true to myself, because I know that I'm not a pleaser. I cannot please everybody. Do you have any coaching for me? Oh,
No, I think what you're saying is really important. You're filtering it through what's important to you. The one thing I would say, and I'm only sharing this with you because that's feedback I've gotten before. I think people just crave humanity in others.
yes.
And when, again, this is a mistake that I make constantly. When, I always feel the need to show up and know everything and be the best. And I found that the way to connect with people is actually to admit what I don't know and what I'm scared of and what I'm worried about, and not to an extent that it's like too much, but even finding, I coach my CEOs a lot to find strategic moments of vulnerability. And it doesn't have to be all the time.
Yes.
But just as a way to connect with people even more.
And you mentioned that at the end of the feedback, we can say thank you. So I attended a workshop in LA last year. So they told us about how to respond to a feedback. So they said that you can say, thank you for caring enough about me to give me this feedback. So you're elaborative, not just thank you for caring enough about me to give me this genuine feedback, even though you don't like it.
I love it. That's great.
So as a listener to this podcast, I'm thinking, Tasha, I don't know if I'm self-aware or not. So how should I know if I'm self-aware?
Okay, so let me give you a couple of data points that hopefully will make us all feel both better and worse at the same time. And I'll explain why. So we found that 95% of people believe that they are self-aware, but only about 10 to 15% of us actually are. Now, there's good news and bad news. The good news is, all of us are in this journey together. And the odds are, on a good day, 80% of us are fooling ourselves about whether we're fooling ourselves, right? So there's sort of this, like, if we can normalize the fact that most of us aren't as self-aware as we think we are, then it becomes a lot less scary and a lot less intimidating. So the other piece that I would say is it's a good default assumption to make that we don't know ourselves as well as we think we do. And it should never be in a way that diminishes us or makes us less confident. I think that's the opposite of what I would ever suggest. But it's almost like this innate curiosity. When we get feedback that's surprising, we might go, well, that's interesting. What's that about? And I think if we have that orientation, in some ways, it almost doesn't matter if we're self-aware because we're constantly striving to learn more. And in that process of learning more, the paradox is that's when we get more self-aware.
Do you think happiness is connected or correlated with self-awareness?
We have looked at happiness. It was more like life satisfaction. We have found a significant correlation. So people who are self-aware, I could just rattle off this whole list, but as it relates to happiness and well-being, they are happier with their lives. They feel more in control. They're less anxious, less stressed, less depressed. So for sure. But I think an important thing to note there is sometimes people say, can I be too self-aware?
Yes.
And what I think is behind that question is almost like people are worried about flipping over so that they're so focused on themselves or how other people see them that they start to get neurotic about it. And what we learned with our highly self-aware people is they were just as self-accepting as they were self-aware. And there was one gentleman who was an architect. He said something like, the real challenge about self-awareness isn't necessarily finding out who you are. It's loving that person that you find out you are.
Is there self-love?
Whatever you want to call it, I think you could call it self-acceptance, self-love, self-compassion. That is a really critical piece of self-awareness. So as we're learning more, the question is, what are we doing about it? Are we using that to beat ourselves up? That's not self-awareness. Are we using it to have a better, more holistic picture of who we are and how we're showing up? And that's a good thing. That's closer to, I think, the Holy Grail.
So Tasha, how do you cultivate more happiness and joy in your life?
I am not an expert on that. So that would be the first thing I would say. I think for me, it's the ability to do what I love and do what I do best. And that might be a limited picture of it. And that's why I say I'm not an expert. But for me, my purpose in life is to help as many people as possible be successful and live great lives.
Serving, or you're saying that you're serving the community.
Exactly. And so for me, I find that I'm happiest when I'm doing that. So I think if, a first step of many, I'm sure you can have a better expert talk about that, is to make sure that what you're doing is something that you care about and that you feel is having an impact in the way you want to impact the world.
Got it. Do you have any advice for somebody who thinks they are not self-aware?
Well, I would say, first of all, good work. Because I actually think the biggest problem of self-awareness is people not knowing how much they need to improve. Because if you're completely closed off, it means that even if you might get the greatest feedback ever, but if you think you're self-aware and you think you already know everything there is to know, you're not going to listen to that, and you're probably less likely to act on it. So what I would say is, for someone who isn't self-aware, flip it around. You're halfway there just by saying, I want to learn more about myself. The question then is, what do you want to do about it? I think sometimes we can get in these endless loops of self-scrutiny. Think about, which type of self-awareness do you want to develop? Do you want to be more internally self-aware and know what you're about? Do you want to be more externally self-aware and have stronger relationships and sort of more success professionally and personally? That would be a good place to start. So I would say don't like revel in it too much. See it as an opportunity and take action.
Could you suggest some online resources or books to cultivate more self-awareness along with your book, for sure?
Sure. I mean, I'm a little biased, but yeah. So Insight is one of the things I'm the most proud of. So I would hope that would be helpful to people. We actually did just come out with a brand new virtual course called the Future Ready Leader. And it's my attempt to clone myself, because, when you're working with senior executives and you're only one person, there are only so many people you can work with kind of one-on-one. And so what my goal with this course was to kind of democratize development, to have anybody who finds these tools valuable and wants to put them into practice in their life to be a better formal or informal leader, that they're available to them. So I'm really excited about this. We've had some great feedback. It's got a lot of interactive exercises and assessments and worksheets. So if anybody's interested in that, I think you're putting it in the show notes, but it's called the Future Ready Leader. In terms of other resources, it's almost like too overwhelming to start with. Let me give you one more, because this is something specific that you asked earlier. If anybody's listening to this and they're wondering, how self-aware am I really? Which, by the way, I'd say good job, because that's exactly the question you should be asking. For the launch of Insight several years ago, we created this free Insight quiz. And initially it was just for the book launch, but people loved it so much, and it's a free resource that we have kept supporting it just because we want to make the world more self-aware and help people as much as we can. But it's a 5-minute assessment. You fill it out for yourself. It's 14 questions. You send it to someone who knows you well. They fill out the 14 questions for how they see you. And then when the system has both sets of data, it generates a report that gives you a high-level view of your internal and external self-awareness, and then a couple of things you can do to improve. And so if anybody wants that totally free, no strings attached, it's at insight-quiz.com.
You have one more link, correct me if I'm wrong, 360 assessment, bankable leadership. Is that same or different?
Yeah. Oh, that's a blast from the past. Yeah, that's another free resource we made available actually for the launch of my first book, Bankable Leadership. That's about how do you as a leader manage the tension between creating results for your business and engaging and motivating your team. And the book is basically about the fact that most leaders who struggle are not balanced. They focus on one at the expense of the other. But the assessments, you're exactly right. It's free. It takes about 5 minutes. You send it to, I think, between 5 and 10 people. And then once the system has a minimum number of responses, it'll generate, it's basically a free 360 is the way to look at it. And it's not quite as popular because I'm not on as many podcasts talking about it, but it is there if anyone would find that valuable.
I need that personally.
Yeah, free 360, right? Why not?
Yeah. And you talk a lot about decision making in your work. So, decision, as Tony Robbins says, a quality of a life depends on the quality of decisions we make. So,
Right.
any principle, any framework that you use to make good and great decisions in your life?
This is kind of a philosophical framework, so it's not as, do
Please,
this and do
yeah.
this.
We
Yeah.
love philosophy.
I think that, especially for executives or anybody making lots of decisions, we have this tendency to move to action. So I think there are two prerequisites for good decision making. Number one is seeing clearly, and number two is acting decisively. And where I see people struggle is, sometimes they get stuck in part one, but more often they get stuck in part two, where they're just trying to act or trying to respond or firefight or crisis manage without seeing the situation clearly. And so I think if you think about that as seeing clearly is about knowing, first and foremost, self-awareness. It's about, am I creating, if I'm in an organization, am I creating a culture where people are telling the truth, where people are being candid, where we have the right information so that we can see clearly? Do I have the data I need to make this decision? And then once you have that, acting decisively, it's not easy, but it becomes a lot easier. And so I think that's the framework that I use with my executives, especially like, are we seeing this clearly enough that we can move to the decisiveness phase?
Yeah, so that is so wonderful. I think a lot of people get anxiety before they even make decisions. So if you don't have any data, there is no point in getting anxiety.
Exactly. Go get the data. Yeah, exactly.
Do you feel that intuition plays a good role in decision making?
For sure. I had a mentor very early in my career who coached me. I think I was trying to make a decision about whether I was going to take a job that I had been offered. And he said, what I always do is I write a pro and con list, and then I tear it up and I sleep on it. And I wake up in the morning and say, what is my gut telling me to do? Isn't that great?
I did that last year.
Did you?
I was getting a promotion and I rejected that promotion based on the pros and cons.
Good for you. And I think that's what's interesting is analyzing a situation can often be the data we need to make a good gut decision.
I applied this principle from Tony Robbins that you think about the upside and downside and think about different options. Having one option is not an option. You got to have at least 2 or 3 options to really decide whether you want to do it or not.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. So do you know anybody? I'm sure you would know a lot of people. Any one person that comes to your mind who is self-aware, who is happy, successful, fulfilled?
Oh my gosh. Yes. So I'll give you one. This is a great example. So this is my friend, Florence Ozer, and she is born and raised and lives in Nigeria. And she spent the, majority of her early years in her 20s as well as being kind of bookish and, never wanted to rock the boat, was the last person in a group of people who would want to be in center stage. And as she was in a leadership development program, the 276 girls in Nigeria were kidnapped, right, by Boko Haram. We all remember Bring Back Our Girls. And she felt something awaken within her when she said, basically, and there's a great cost to being an activist. So she said, no matter what it costs me, I am going to do whatever I can to advocate to the Nigerian government that we need to bring these girls home. And there's a lot in that story that not a lot of people know. Like, the Nigerian government knew exactly where the girls were being held when they were abducted. And so she and her compatriots started the Bring Back Our Girls movement. And they protested every single day in the capital, in Abuja, until they actually got some action from the government. And so I think what is so powerful about that example for Florence, in addition to the many, many things she does to stay self-aware, is she was open to a different way of seeing herself. She was open to showing up in the world in a way, again, that wasn't consistent with her past behavior, but that was truly more reflective of who she was. And it was kind of a 180 in her life. She went from being this person on the sidelines to being, one of the most important voices in so many issues that surrounded her. So I just think that's a really inspiring, great example for all of us.
So Tasha, what have you learned personally from her?
Oh my gosh. Well, that we need another podcast on that.
I would love it.
I think what is truly worth fighting for and why it's important to take risks. If you found something that is truly worth fighting for, to be willing to back that up with, a potential cost. And I think I'm brave in some ways, but I'm not brave in that way. And she just constantly inspires me.
Let's visualize, if we can visualize that. If Florence is listening to this podcast, what would you tell her?
I'd tell her I love her, and I think she'll be the president of Nigeria in the not too distant future. We'll have to make sure to send this to her. She'll be so embarrassed, and maybe she'll love it. Who knows?
Can we put her details in the show notes?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I will take her social handles from me later on. By the way, coming back to decision making again, do you remember any instance, if you don't mind speaking about that you failed in making some good decisions? Any instance that comes to your mind?
Failed in making good decisions. Well, I guess my teenage years are probably out. I think pretty much everybody has had that experience. Nothing is coming to mind, not because I haven't made lots and lots of bad decisions, but just because I think I'm so focused on thinking about the self-awareness research that I can't ponder it as much as I would want to give you a good answer. So there are plenty of examples, and I am always learning, but nothing is coming to mind right now. I'm sorry, I can't be more helpful.
No worries. So what are you most excited about in coming years?
I want to get back on the road again, and I want to try to rebuild my speaking practice and being able to travel. I remember thinking to myself in January, I literally had this thought, like, could my life be any more perfect? So unlike, I think there's a lot of people who have decided that they want to make some major changes in their life, and that's been valuable. What I am discovering is that I am doubling down on what I was doing before, and obviously learning and growing, and I'm working on a new book, but that is what makes me pretty much happier than anything. So that's what I'm excited about.
Would you like to talk about your new book in brief?
Yeah, I don't have a ton of really smart things to say about it yet, but I can maybe tell you generally what it's about, if that would be interesting. So I started working on this book maybe the middle of last year, and through my friend Chip Heath gave me some really great advice.
I love him.
Yeah, he just loves the beginning part of book processes, and I always get overwhelmed. But what we came up with is when bad things happen. And, in the workplace particularly, there are so many opportunities for us to, intentionally or unintentionally be hurt or wronged or betrayed even by other people. And what I wanted to do was have a better understanding of, what are these bad things? It's called interpersonal injury. That's what the scientists call it. I call them bad things because that's easier to say. But what are the characteristics of those events? How can I come up with a model to help people better understand the different ways we can be wronged and hurt and harmed at work? And generally it's coming into sort of four buckets. One of them is things that are unfair. So like justice and fairness. There is harm to our livelihood. There's harm to our humanity, harm to our reputation. And so now what I'm looking into is what can knowing that teach us, right? Like, are there different outcomes for those events? Are there certain events that are more difficult? And so I'm really trying to understand the bad things themselves. And then probably equally importantly, I want to learn how people can rise above them. It's been really interesting. We've done about 300 interviews with people all around the world on the bad things that have happened to them at work. And it's incredible. I was coding an interview today, and it was a woman who was telling us about something that happened literally 15 years ago. And she was crying the whole time. And so for me, my driving force behind this book is people are in pain, right? There's so many things that are hard to manage about the workplace. And I think this is one that just hasn't gotten a lot of time and attention. It's not something people almost ever talk about. like you hurt my feelings. But what I want to do is help maybe find some of the surprising, scientifically supported ways that we can move on from that and even use those situations to be more successful.
Yes, that is so wonderful. And since you were talking about cheap heat, so I would like to say that there are 2 books of cheap heat that I've read and I read over and over. One book is how to change things when the change is hard. And second book is The Power of Moments. Amazing book. Amazing.
Those are also my 2 favorite of Chip and Dan's books.
I go back and forth, and there are so many great nuggets. How to find purpose, passion, how to create moments in any conversation, how to make change. Change is hard, any behavior change is hard. And I've learned so many things in my personal and professional life just from these 2 books. You can literally copy paste things from those books.
and solve all of your challenges in life. Yeah, it was interesting. Switch is, if I had to pick my favorite business book of all time, it would probably be Switch. And The Power of Moments was it just packed such an emotional punch. There were, I'm like crying and it's such a beautiful book. And I love them kind of in different ways, but I think they're 2 of the best books out there, honestly.
Yeah. So, and then the last but not the least thing is I had a little bit of crying moment when I was watching your TED Talk, when you ended your TED Talk by this quote from Rumi Jalaluddin. Yesterday I was clever, so I wanted to change the world. Today I am wise, so I am changing myself.
It's a pretty good one, isn't it?
Yeah. All right, Tasha. So do you have any closing thought or anything that you want to share for our listeners?
I would just say that the journey to self-awareness is a lifelong journey. It can be punctuated by joys and by sorrows. It can be difficult. It can feel slow. It can make you feel vulnerable. But it is one of the most important journeys that any of us will take. And just by virtue of being willing to go on it, you are ahead of most people. So keep up the good fight. Don't give up, and know that it's going to help you be better, happier, and burn brightly.
Yes. And where can we find you online and anything about you?
I'm everywhere. I'm very easy to find. TashaEurich.com, InsightBook.com. But I would recommend the Insight quiz probably first and foremost. If anybody's interested in this topic, it's a great place to start.
Great, Tasha. Thank you so much. It was wonderful conversation with you. It was
so good to connect with you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to this podcast episode today. If you did enjoy this, please subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcast, or you can visit https://nishantgarg.me, NISHANTGARG.me. You can also share this episode with your loved ones to help them live a fulfilled life. You are not alone in this journey. We all struggle in life. There is no shame in talking about it. I go through my highs and lows. I get depressed, and these practices help me in living a resilient life. You can also do this. You got this. Don't judge yourself. You are doing the best you can. And thank you so much again.